Good morning. This week's discussion centers on recent scholarship. My selection was Jonathan Edwards and an article by Douglas Winiarski on the radical revivalism in the Connecticut Valley in the 1740s. Beginning on July 5th, 1741, Jonathan Edwards delivered powerful sermons to hundreds of people throughout Massachusetts, specifically in Northampton, Suffield, and ending in Enfield with a very famous sermon entitled Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. The Enfield sermon's significance is the amount of scrutiny that's been applied to it by historians. Literary critics, scholars, students have all applied rigorous rhetorical analysis. Edwards not only employed images to support his presentation, but he also skillfully used repetitive phrases and allowed competing ideas of terror and hope to commingle in his sermons. Now, this had the effect of allowing personal emotions and themes to be rationalized and even carried out through various acts, physical acts. Still, theologians and historians have branded sinners as an anomaly. Instead, what I would argue is that they should recognize it as an apex of his work, a natural progression, if you will, that arrived at what he had been building up through all of his previous work. Edwards was best known for his defense of Calvinism, which proposed Scripture to be the sole authority and recognized a genuine communion with the risen Lord. Images of saints and crucifixions were rejected, and he favored the congregational singing of psalms. Calvinists required proof of one's election to be free of that judgment. They did so through three tests, which were approximate but attainable. These included a profession of faith, a disciplined Christian behavior, and a love of the sacraments. Now, this explanation of Calvinism is important to understand the various interpretations and synthesis of Edwards' work as a philologist. Edwin Cady in 1949 and Edward J. Gallagher again in 2000 provide similar accounts of Edwards' rhetorical strategies. Cady focused more on Edwards' oratory skills, but Gallagher goes further and admits to Edwards' work being in the context of the framework of the text, his audience, and in particular the arena in which the sermon took place. Ross Pudeloff dismisses the universal appeal of Edwards, placing the uniqueness of sinners as more of a local phenomena, unique to Massachusetts, if you will. This supports Gallagher's admission of the concept of arena, which I think is important to being called out as an anomaly. However, there's a problem with Pudeloff's analysis. He presuppositions 18th century New England society within the parameters of socioeconomic and intellectual capacity, which was much greater than may have been recognized. Over and over, the historiography of journal reviews of Edwards' sermons centers. We see a rehashing of the same conclusions or dismissal of the work as an anomaly. Instead, historians should admit they haven't figured out how to fit sinners into their narrative. Lee Eric Schmidt calls this out, takes a shot at by calling out historians for bashing the tome while continuing to cite and reprint it. So Schmidt concedes the trend is leveling and perhaps subsiding, ultimately leading us to George Marsden's very important corrective treatment of Edwards in his work, Jonathan Edwards' A Life, a book. Marsden uniquely affords sinners to be the most famous, if not the apex of Edwards' career, but he does so by diminishing the hysteria surrounding Edwards' sermon, casting doubt on the accuracy of that facet. It's crucial because Edwards criticized George Whitefield in 1740 of delivering a grand sermon, a lot of histrionics and theatrics that evoked behavior in people that perhaps should be discounted. False conversions, counterfeits, errors in judgment. Ironic coming from Edwards, still a proper study of the primary source account of Stephen Williams, a clergyman who was actually there from Longmeadow, who claims to have been brought to tears and talked about the amazing grip that the sermon had and how Edwards and others had to calm the congregants down after the sermon. So history points out the lore of the Enfield sermon. It credits the immediate revival it supposedly stirred, but in reality, the available sources conclude that if a sermon occurred at the height of the revival, and that Edwards, along with George Whitefield and others, had an effect and aggregate over the entire region, it was more because people were ripe to receive the word. It's a radical departure from Calvinism. Edwards had gone too far. Winters ends his work with a typical conclusion or summary. Instead, the article kind of tapers off in a reflection, allowing us for further research on this very interesting subject. Not an anomaly, but a progression that deserves a conclusion, not provided in its work, but requires continuation. Thank you.